The Boston winter gnawed at the edges of the city, its icy breath weaving through the crowded plaza where Claire Sterling stood, a solitary figure in a world she'd conquered. Her Gucci handbag, clutched tightly, was a silent shield against the chaos of December. Her heels clicked against the frost-dusted pavement, each step a testament to her control, her empire built over 2 decades of relentless ambition. But then a voice, small, clear, and impossibly warm, pierced the chill like a beacon, slicing through the wind's bite. "Would you like to have dinner with us, ma'am? We've got space." Claire froze, her breath catching as she glanced down. There stood Eli Harper, no older than 6, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold, dark curls damp with snow. He clutched a grease-stained paper bag, his threadbare mittens barely holding together, but his eyes sparkled with a magic no boardroom could ever contain. "Excuse me?" Claire murmured, her voice softer than intended, as if roused from a dream. Eli's grin widened, undeterred by her hesitation. "I said, we saved a seat, me and Daddy. It's Christmas, you know. Nobody should be alone." Her hands tightened around the leather strap of her bag, the weight of her empire, 20 years of steel and strategy, suddenly fragile under the earnest gaze of a child who saw her, not her title. No one had spoken to her like that in years, not without an agenda, a pitch, a plea for her favor. Around her the city pulsed. Shoppers hurried past, arms laden with bags, their faces buried in distractions. Her security detail lingered discreetly by the sleek black car at the curb, a quiet reminder of her isolation. But Eli stood there patient, hopeful, his small frame a lighthouse in the storm of her solitude. Claire opened her mouth, searching for words she hadn't yet formed, when a sharp voice cut across the plaza. "Eli!" A man in a frayed wool coat strode toward them, his face taut with worry. James Carter, broad-shouldered and weary, stopped short when he saw her. Claire Sterling, the woman whose name graced Ink and Fast Company, the billionaire who once declared, "Compassion doesn't scale, systems do." His eyes flicked to his son, then back to her, his jaw tightening with a father's fierce protectiveness. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping between them, a wall of quiet strength. "He didn't mean to bother you." Claire's response slipped out before she could stop it. "I wasn't bothered." The words hung in the air, unguarded, raw, a crack in her polished facade. Snowflakes swirled between them, delicate eavesdroppers in the tense silence. James gave her a skeptical once-over, his eyes searching for the catch. "Well, still, we'll get out of your way." Eli tugged at his father's coat, undaunted. "But Daddy, she looks sad." Claire's breath hitched, a pang slicing through her chest. James winced, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Eli, come on!" But Claire knelt, her tailored coat brushing the snowy ground, a movement that surprised even herself. She met Eli's gaze, his eyes wide and unflinching. "Why do you think I'm sad?" she asked. Eli shrugged, his voice matter-of-fact. "Your coat's fancy, but your eyes, they're empty." James groaned, rubbing his temple. "We're going. Now." Claire's voice, steady and soft, stopped him. "Where's dinner?" James blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "You said you had a seat," she said, her eyes on Eli, who beamed like he'd won a secret victory. "Where is it?" Eli chirped. "It's not far. We live in the red brick building on South End, the one with the lights that blink like they're haunted. Daddy says they're possessed." James exhaled, a mix of exasperation and surrender. "You don't have to do this." Claire rose, her voice carrying a quiet resolve. "I know, but I want to." He studied her, searching for a motive, a publicity stunt, a whim, a trap. But she held his gaze unflinching, though a flicker of vulnerability danced in her eyes, a glimpse of the exhaustion she'd buried beneath her success. "Okay," he said finally, his voice low, "but we don't do fancy." Claire's lips curved, a ghost of a smile. "Good. I've had enough fancy to last a lifetime." The apartment was a third-floor walk-up in South End, its stairwell steeped in the faint scent of old paint and honest struggle. Claire ducked to avoid a cracked light fixture, its dim glow flickering like a heartbeat. Eli bounded ahead, humming a tune about snowmen and spaghetti, his small feet echoing on the worn steps. James unlocked the door, his movements deliberate, almost hesitant. "It's not much," he said. "It's not nothing," Claire replied, her voice soft but certain. Inside, warmth enveloped her, not just from the rattling radiator, but from the lived-in charm of mismatched cushions, a threadbare blanket slung over a sagging couch, and a tiny Christmas tree crafted from cardboard and tinsel, glowing with defiant pride. Eli pointed at it, his chest puffed out. "That's our tree. I made it at school. It's got a dinosaur star." Claire let out a laugh, not the polished chuckle she used in boardrooms, but a real, unguarded burst that surprised her as much as it did James. He raised an eyebrow, a spark of amusement softening his guarded expression. "I'll see if there's enough spaghetti left." "I'm not hungry," Claire said, then paused, correcting herself. "Not for food." James glanced at her, his hands stilling over the stove. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered, as if trying to decipher the woman who had stepped into their world. Claire drifted to the small kitchen table, its surface scarred but sturdy. Two chairs sat there, one with an extra cushion folded neatly on the seat. She touched it, her fingers brushing the worn fabric. Eli noticed, his voice bright. "That one's yours." "You didn't know I was coming," Claire said, her brow furrowing. Eli tilted his head, wise beyond his years. "Sometimes people show up, so we always leave a chair." "For Mom," he added softly, his voice dipping. Claire turned, her heart catching. James froze, a jar of marinara sauce poised mid-pour. "Eli," he said, a warning in his tone. "It's okay," Eli said, unfazed. "She died when I was a baby, but Daddy says her chair should never be empty, just in case someone needs it." Claire sat slowly, the cushion warm beneath her, as if it had been waiting for her all along. James set a plate of spaghetti and buttered toast before her, presenting it with the quiet dignity of a four-course meal. "Bon appétit," he said, his voice dry but not unkind. She twirled the noodles, her movements mechanical at first, then softer, as if the act of eating here was a ritual she'd forgotten. Eli sat across from her, chewing with gusto. "You don't have to finish it all," he offered, his eyes sparkling. "But if you cry, it means you like it." James nearly choked on his toast, shooting his son a look. Claire smiled, a real smile that felt foreign on her lips. "I'll keep that in mind." They ate in a companionable hush, no talk of deals or empires, just the clink of forks and the soft hum of a boy who believed in waiting chairs and a man who cooked with a care he didn't know he still possessed. When the meal ended, Claire stood, folding her napkin with a gentleness she hadn't known she had. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, but Eli reached out, pressing a folded piece of paper into her hand. She opened it, a crayon drawing of three figures at a table. The woman with bright yellow hair and a bold heart over her chest. Beneath it, in Eli's jagged scrawl, "Miss Claire, your chair is always here." She looked at the boy, then at the man who had built a life from scraps and still raised a child who believed in open seats. "Good night," she whispered. And for the first time in 20 years, Claire Sterling walked away from a dinner table feeling full. Not of food, but of something she hadn't dared name. The city roared back to life around her, all noise and glass, indifferent to the small miracle she carried in her pocket. In the sterile glow of her penthouse kitchen, Claire Sterling stood motionless, a porcelain coffee mug cradled in her hands, its contents untouched, forgotten. The Boston skyline glittered below, a dazzling lie of promises she no longer believed in. Her phone buzzed incessantly, meetings, memos, board approvals, but her eyes were fixed on the folded crayon drawing beside the sink. Eli's gift, sacred in its simplicity. 3 stick figures, 1 heart, a table, and a chair, just for her. She should have dismissed it as childish sentiment, a fleeting indulgence. But all night, her dreams had been woven with tinsel dinosaurs and buttered toast, the clink of mismatched chairs, and a child's voice saying, "You don't look lonely when you smile." No one had ever seen her that way, not once. The words lingered, a quiet rebellion against the empire of silence she'd built. Later that afternoon, on the 57th floor of Sterling Ventures, Claire sat behind a desk carved from imported walnut, the city sprawling vast and cold beyond her window. Her assistant, Sophie Grant, peeked in, her voice tentative. "The board's waiting. Should I hold them?" Claire shook her head, her gaze still on the drawing she'd pulled from her bag. "No." "Let them wait. 10 minutes." Sophie blinked, startled by the uncharacteristic pause, but nodded and slipped away. Alone, Claire traced a pen over Eli's words. "Your chair is always here." Each letter a tether to a world she hadn't known she craved. She considered a polished thank you, a gift basket, something her world would deem appropriate. But it felt wrong, like boxing a wildflower and sending it to someone who knew only the grit of real soil. Instead, she stood, her breath steadying, and reached for her coat. "Cancel the meeting," she told Sophie on her way out. "Tell them I'm attending something more important." The South End walk-up looked smaller in the daylight, its red brick facade humble against the city's towering ambitions. Claire hesitated outside, staring at the building as if it might vanish if she blinked. This wasn't her world. Grit, struggle, warmth. It wasn't meant to be. Yet she pressed the buzzer, her heart a quiet drumbeat. After a long pause, the door cracked open, and James Carter's eyes met hers through the gap. Recognition flickered, then disbelief, and something far more cautious. "Miss Sterling," he said slowly, his voice laced with suspicion. "To what do we owe the honor?" She raised the drawing, her fingers trembling slightly. "I came to return this," and the scarf Eli forgot. James opened the door wider, his brow furrowing. "You could have mailed it." Claire's voice softened, steady but raw. "I don't like mailing things that matter." The words gave him pause, a crack in his guarded armor. "Come in," he said finally, stepping aside. "I've got 15 minutes before I fix a leaking pipe across town." The apartment felt different without Eli's chatter, its warmth quieter but no less potent. Claire sat at the same table, the chair with the extra cushion still there, waiting for her. James poured coffee, his rough hands surprisingly gentle with the chipped mug as he slid it toward her. "You run a billion-dollar empire," he said, his voice low, "and you're here in a place where the heater sings opera every morning." Claire's lips twitched, a faint smile breaking through. "I've had enough silence. Opera's an upgrade." James smirked, a spark of amusement softening his edges. "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you," she replied. "You're not angry." "Not yet," he said, sitting across from her, his eyes searching. "I'm trying to figure out why a woman like you would step into our world. Guilt? Curiosity?" Claire's gaze dropped to the mug, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "Maybe I just missed the sound of being needed." James didn't speak, the weight of her words settling between them. After a long moment, he leaned forward. "That's a dangerous thing to say. Needing and being needed. They're different roads. One's a dead end." Her eyes flickered, a quiet defiance in their depths. "I used to believe that. I'm not sure I do anymore." Suddenly, the air shifted, heavy with truths too big to name, neither warmer nor cooler but alive with possibility. "You don't have to rescue us," James said, his voice firm. "We're not a charity case." "I know," Claire replied. "You're not here to fix us, are you?" She shook her head, her voice barely audible. "Maybe I came because, for once, I didn't feel like the one being fixed." James stared at her, his expression unreadable, a man caught between distrust and something softer. Finally, he stood. "I have to go." Claire rose too, her heart a quiet ache. "Will you tell Eli I stopped by?" James walked her to the door, his voice steady but not unkind. "He'll want to know, but if you're planning to vanish, do us a favor. Don't come again." Claire paused, her hand on the doorknob, her gaze meeting his. "I won't disappear," she said, her voice a braid of steel and softness. "Rich people always say that," James replied, his tone sharp but not cruel. She turned, holding his gaze unwavering. "Then maybe it's time someone didn't." That night, James found Eli cross-legged on the living room floor, coloring with a fury only a child could muster. "Miss Claire came back," Eli said without looking up, his voice bright with certainty. James frowned, crouching beside him. "I know. She didn't take the picture." Eli held up a new drawing, this one sharper, more vivid. 3 figures sat at a table. Claire's stick figure wore glasses, James's held a coffee mug, and beside Claire's chair was a second, empty one. James raised a brow. "Who's that one for?" Eli grinned, his eyes alight with unguarded hope. "In case she brings someone lonely with her next time." James sat beside him, stunned by the simple logic of a child who hadn't learned to guard his heart. "Do you really think she'll come again?" he asked. Eli didn't hesitate. "She already has a seat." He handed James a crayon. "Want to help color the stars on the ceiling?" James took it, nodding, a quiet shift stirring within him. Maybe this wasn't a rescue mission. Maybe it was an invitation, one he was starting to consider saying yes to. Late Sunday morning, Claire stood across the street from the Carter apartment, her coat collar upturned against the Boston chill, a paper bag from an old bookstore tucked under her arm. The city stretched its limbs, the air carrying the scent of fresh bagels and distant sirens. She held her breath, unsure what she expected. Eli's face pressed against the window, waving with both hands, or James opening the door with that quiet suspicion he wore like a second skin. Nothing stirred. She turned to leave, then stopped. Taped to the building's door was a child's drawing, faded crayon lines on the back of a grocery receipt. A woman with long yellow hair, a table, 2 chairs, still there, still waiting. Inside, James was scraping toast crumbs into the sink when a knock came. Eli darted to the door, shouting, "It's her!" James sighed. "Eli, wait." But it was too late. The door flew open, and Claire stood there, breathless, a little unsure. Eli hugged her leg instantly. "You came back." Claire steadied herself, the small gesture anchoring her in a way she hadn't expected. "I did," she said, smiling, "but only because you promised your dad makes the world's best pancakes." Eli turned, eyes wide. "Dad?" She said yes. James appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable, a man caught between doubt and something softer. "Didn't expect to see you again." Claire held up the bookstore bag. "I found something. Thought Eli might like it." James stepped aside, letting her in without a word. The book was old, its hardbound cover cracked with time. Designs for young visionaries. Eli flipped through it, his fingers grazing the pages with awe, as if they might dissolve under his touch. "Where'd you find this?" James asked, his voice low, curious. "Someone gave it to me when I was young," Claire replied, her eyes distant. "It taught me that blueprints aren't just for buildings. They're for second chances." Eli looked up, his voice bright. "Can I draw buildings with stars in them?" Claire crouched beside him, her smile soft but sure. "You can build anything, as long as you remember who you're building for." Later, when Eli ran off to color skyscrapers made of marshmallows and moonlight, Claire lingered by the table. James handed her a mug of tea, not asking what she preferred, as if he already knew. "Still don't like silence?" he asked. She sipped the tea, her voice quiet. "I'm learning to listen to it. It's louder than I thought." James studied her, his gaze careful, searching. "You really used to read that book?" Claire nodded, her eyes tracing the table's scars. "On nights when the world felt like a locked room." He leaned against the counter, his voice softer now. "So, what opened the door?" Claire hesitated, then met his gaze. "I didn't open it. Someone left a chair on the other side." The South End apartment was quiet that night, save for the soft hum of the radiator and the gentle rhythm of Eli's breathing. Curled on the sagging couch, the 6-year-old clutched a half-colored blueprint, its edges curling like the heart-shaped building he'd drawn. Claire Sterling watched him, her gaze soft, her heart caught in the tender stillness of a child who dreamed in stars and open chairs. James Carter stood at the sink, scrubbing the few dishes from their simple meal, his movements steady but heavy with unspoken weight. "He's a good kid," Claire said softly, her voice barely stirring the air. James nodded, his eyes on the suds. "I've tried to give him a world that doesn't lie to him." She tilted her head, a quiet question in her eyes. "And have you?" He glanced at her, his expression raw. "I've tried." Claire drifted to the window, the Boston skyline pulsing beyond the glass, a constellation of lives she no longer felt tethered to. "My parents were ghosts in tailored suits," she said, her voice low, laced with a pain she rarely let surface. I used to knock on their doors even when they were open. James dried his hands, the dish towel moving in slow, deliberate circles, his silence an invitation for her to continue. They adopted me from a state home when I was 8, she said, her words measured, each one a stone laid bare. Sent me to boarding school 2 years later because my laughter was too disruptive. A single humorless laugh escaped her. I learned to be quiet. Then I learned to be loud enough to be listened to, but I never learned to be heard. James stepped closer, his presence steady, grounding. Who hears you now? He asked, his voice a quiet challenge. Claire turned, her eyes meeting his, vulnerable yet fierce. Eli does, she whispered, and you might. The space between them held no promises, only the fragile shimmer of possibility. James exhaled, a sound that carried years of guarded hope. You want to come with us tomorrow? Eli's got a school open house. He's presenting something called the Chair of Feelings. Claire blinked, caught off guard. The what? A smirk tugged at James's lips, softening his edges. Apparently, it's a chair where you sit when you're too full of emotions to talk. Claire's smile bloomed, warm and genuine. Sounds like something the world could use more of. She paused, then added, You sure you're not busy building skyscrapers? James's eyes held hers, searching. Tomorrow I'd rather build trust. He reached past her to the coat closet, pulling out the scarf she'd left behind that first night. Handing it to her, he said, We don't keep what isn't ours, but we hold on to it, just in case they come back. Claire took the scarf, her fingers brushing the soft fabric, a lifeline to a place she hadn't dared call home. Then I guess I'm glad I did, she said, wrapping it around her neck as she stepped into the evening chill. For the first time in decades, Claire Sterling realized she hadn't just visited this place. Some part of her had begun to belong. 17 days had passed since she first sat at the Carter's kitchen table, though she told herself she wasn't counting. The books she dropped off for Eli, the quiet inquiries about city permits James hadn't asked for, the pauses to say she was in the neighborhood. They were all coincidences, she insisted. But on a Tuesday afternoon, as snow gathered softly on the fire escape, Claire arrived to find the apartment door ajar, laughter spilling out like sunlight. Warm, full-bellied, unpolished laughter that stopped the moment she stepped inside. James was crouched on the floor, helping Eli glue popsicle sticks into a lopsided castle. Eli looked up, his grin wide enough to light the room. Miss Claire, you're just in time. We're building Fort Feelings. James didn't smile. He rose slowly, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his eyes guarded. You weren't expected today, he said, his voice low, cautious. Claire held up a bag, her smile tentative. I brought gingerbread, the real kind, with spice and burnt edges. Eli jumped up, his excitement uncontainable. Did you bring the story? The one about the tall building made of glass and sunlight? Claire blinked, caught off guard. What story? The one you promised, Eli insisted, his eyes sparkling with expectation. She glanced at James, who was already turning away, his shoulders tense. Maybe later, she said softly. I should come back another time. But Eli grabbed her hand, his grip small but fierce. You always say that. The word always landed like a stone. Too honest, too heavy. James turned back, his voice firm. Eli, give us a minute. Eli huffed but obeyed, retreating to his room in a whirlwind of crayons and half-eaten cookies. Silence settled like fog, thick and unyielding. Claire set the bag on the table, her movements deliberate. He asked me to come, she said. I didn't. James's words cut sharper than he likely intended. Claire didn't flinch, but her chest tightened. I know. He crossed his arms, his gaze piercing. Why are you really here, Claire? She looked at him, really looked, and spoke a truth that felt like unraveling a tightly wound thread. Because I forgot what kindness felt like without strings. This place, this family, reminded me. James's expression didn't soften, but his eyes flickered with something unreadable. I know people like you, he said, a bitter edge to his voice. You love projects, especially broken ones. Claire stepped forward, her voice steady despite the ache within. I'm not here to fix anything. He laughed once, sharp and humorless. Come on, you rearrange the world just to bring my kid a book. You think I don't notice the subtle offers? The hints, the job leads, the quiet saving? Claire's voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the effort to stay open. Is it wrong to help? It is, James said, his voice lower now. If it's about you. The words silenced her, a truth she hadn't faced. I don't want Eli getting used to people who leave, he added, softer, his eyes shadowed by loss. He already lost one chair at that table. Claire's voice broke, but she held his gaze. I didn't come to replace her. James's jaw tightened. No, you came because you're lonely, because this place made you feel something. She looked down, her hand brushing the scarf in her coat pocket, untouched since he'd returned it weeks ago. You think I don't want to run? She said, her voice a whisper, eyes glassy. Every day I wake up and remind myself not to disappear. That's my default. I vanish. I build walls, towers, empires so high no one can knock them down. James said nothing, his silence a canvas for her confession. I left school at 16, she continued, her voice cracking. Built my first company from a storage unit. 8 vending machine crackers for a year. No one believed in me. And when they finally did, it was for the wrong reasons. My name, my brand, my profits. Her breath hitched, raw and unfiltered. But no one ever left a chair for me. Not until Eli. Not until you. James's arms dropped, his expression shifting. Regret, perhaps, or understanding. He leaned on the counter, his voice softer. I don't know how to do this. Neither do I, Claire admitted, her vulnerability laid bare. But I know what not to do, and that's protecting him. I don't blame you, she said, reaching into her coat for the scarf. Slowly, carefully, she placed it on the table between them, a symbol neither of surrender nor victory, but of presence. I won't force a seat at your table, but I left a part of myself here, and that part doesn't want to leave. James looked at the scarf, its soft folds a quiet echo of the night she'd first come. I'm not asking for permission, Claire said, stepping back, her voice steady. I'm just saying I'll be here. She turned toward the door, but James's voice stopped her, quiet but deliberate. Next time, bring 2 scarves. She turned, startled, meeting his eyes. In case the guest brings someone lonely, too. The frost between them didn't melt. It shifted, making room for something new. Later that night in her penthouse, Claire sat alone, the scarf gone but its warmth replaced by a new crayon drawing. 4 chairs now, 1 empty, and beneath, in Eli's jagged print. Some seats take time, but they're worth the wait. She read it once, then again, and smiled. Not because she felt welcome, but because she believed for the first time she could stay. The first Saturday of March dawned bright, sunlight spilling through the apartment windows like an apology for winter's bite. Hope arrived unannounced, as it often does. Eli crouched on the living room floor, scissors in hand, cutting stars from yellow construction paper, some with 5 points, others with 2, one a vague blob with a smiley face at its center. James watched from the kitchen, sipping black coffee, his eyes soft with a father's quiet pride. How many stars do we need for the ceiling, kid? Eli grinned without looking up. As many as it takes to not feel alone at night. James raised an eyebrow. That many, huh? Eli nodded, his voice certain. Miss Claire said the sky has room for all kinds of stars, even the weird ones. James let the words settle, a quiet ripple in his guarded heart. Claire had stopped by twice that week, once with a bag of old puzzle books, then with a box of cookies for no reason at all. She never stayed long, but her presence lingered, like the soft scent of her perfume on the coat Eli had draped over her chair. A question James wasn't ready to answer. At exactly 10:01, the doorbell rang. Eli's face lit up. That's her! James opened the door before he could second-guess himself. Claire stood there, dressed simply in jeans and a slate-gray sweater, her hair tucked behind one ear, holding a thermos and a small wrapped box. Good morning, she said almost shyly. I brought soup, and maybe something else. Eli squealed, pulling her inside. We're making a sky today, Claire laughed, handing James the thermos. Split pea, homemade. Don't worry, I didn't make it. James smirked, a flicker of relief in his eyes. They settled into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Claire sat cross-legged beside Eli, taping stars to the ceiling, her hands careful but unpracticed. James lingered at the table, pretending to read the paper, but every word she spoke drew him in. Eli held up a lopsided star, his voice soft. "This one's for Mommy." Claire's fingers tightened on the roll of tape, her breath catching. "Your mom?" Eli nodded, unfazed. "She's up in the sky now, so I made her a star with a heart inside. Dad says she loves stories." Claire looked at James, who met her gaze briefly before turning away, his jaw tight. Eli continued, his voice light but certain. "Sometimes I dream she's reading to me. Her voice sounds like warm soup and Saturday." Claire's heart ached, her voice a whisper. "That sounds beautiful." Eli tilted his head, his eyes wise beyond his years. "I think maybe she left her chair so someone else could sit there." The words hung in the air, a truth too big for the small room, binding them in a moment that said everything without saying anything at all. "Do you think people do that?" Eli asked, his small voice cutting through the quiet, his eyes bright with a wisdom that belied his 6 years. Claire Sterling blinked, caught off guard, her fingers still clutching the roll of tape. "I think maybe they do," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of his words. "And maybe someone notices the chair is still warm." James Carter exhaled, a soft sound that carried years of unspoken grief. It was one of those moments that said too much without a single word, a fragile bridge built on shared silences. Later, while Eli napped in his fort of paper stars and couch cushions, Claire and James sat at the kitchen table. No distractions, just tea, soft light filtering through the window, and the low hum of trust weaving itself between them. The radiator hissed, a quiet chorus to their unspoken thoughts. "Eli's incredible," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze lingering on the sleeping boy. "He doesn't carry things like other kids. Not with anger." James stirred his tea slowly, the spoon clinking softly against the chipped mug. "He carries things," he said, his voice low, steady. "He just turns them into stars instead of stones." Claire nodded, her heart swelling at the truth of it. "That's a gift." James looked at her, his eyes searching, unguarded for the first time. "So is showing up when you're afraid." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, a quiet acknowledgement of her courage. Claire met his gaze, her voice soft but resolute. "I've spent my whole life trying not to need anyone." She paused, the confession raw, exposing a wound she'd long buried. "And the truth is, I wouldn't have come back if Eli hadn't left that chair for me." James leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Why did you come back the second time?" She hesitated, then spoke with absolute honesty, each word a step into uncharted territory. "Because I wanted someone to miss me." A beat, then softer. And he did. James didn't smile, but his eyes softened, a flicker of warmth breaking through his guarded exterior. "You were right," he said after a moment, his voice low, deliberate. "About chairs." Claire frowned, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" He looked down at his mug, his fingers tracing its edge. "I used to think the hardest part was building a life for Eli, but the truth is, it's been building a space where someone might want to stay." He paused, his voice quieter now. "You made space," Claire said softly, her words a gentle affirmation. "I didn't think I had," he admitted, his gaze lifting to meet hers. "You did," she said, "and I noticed." They sat in that truth, unmoving, letting the silence hold what neither had been brave enough to name. Finally, Claire reached into her bag and slid a small box across the table. James raised an eyebrow, a spark of curiosity in his eyes. "You brought a present." "It's not much," she said, her voice tentative but earnest. "But it's a beginning." He opened it, revealing a brass key, slightly worn, its patina speaking of time rather than polish. "It's the key to a space in South End," she explained, her words careful but resolute. "I bought the building last year for a luxury condo project, but I backed out. It has good bones." James stared at her, uncertain, his fingers tightening around the box. "I saw your old drawings," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "The community center concept, The one with the rooftop garden and reading room. I thought maybe this key could unlock more than just a door. James closed the box, his expression unreadable. Claire, I'm not asking for favors. I'm not offering one, she said gently, her eyes steady. I'm offering a partnership, a place where Eli's stars can glow on real ceilings. A long pause stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Then quietly James spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to thank you. You don't, Claire replied, her voice soft but firm. You show up. He looked at her for a long moment, then, without breaking eye contact, did something unexpected. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. It wasn't romantic nor dramatic. It was grounding, real, a quiet promise in a world of uncertainties. That night, as Claire walked back to her driver, she glanced up at the apartment one last time. A paper star was taped to the window, its corner curling in the breeze. Blue marker scrawled across it. Hope lives here. For the first time in years, Claire believed it might live in her too. Snow returned without warning, blanketing Boston's South End by dusk, shop signs glowing faintly through the flurries, headlights gliding like ghosts in the quiet. It was the kind of night that begged for warmth, for closeness, for staying in. Claire stood outside the Carter apartment, a small thermos and a folded umbrella in her hands, the latter unopened as snow gathered on her shoulders. She was still poised at the edge of a cliff, not afraid to fall, but afraid to leap. Inside, lights glowed, carrying muffled laughter, the clatter of dishes, the faint hum of a TV left too loud. She knocked once, twice. The door opened swiftly and James stood there, sleeves rolled up, hair disheveled, a dish towel slung over his shoulder. You're soaked, he said, his voice tinged with concern. Claire looked down, surprised to find herself wet. I didn't notice. He stepped aside. Come in before you turn into a snowman. She moved past him, silent, her presence a quiet question in the warm air. Inside, Eli lay curled on the couch, a thick blanket tucked under his chin, his cheeks flushed, nose pink. A cartoon flickered in the background, forgotten. He's been sick since last night, James said, lowering his voice. Low fever, nothing dangerous, but he's not sleeping well. Claire knelt beside the couch, her heart softening. Hey, sweetheart, she whispered. Eli's eyes fluttered open, a faint smile crossing his lips. You came. I promised I'd help hang the stars, she said, brushing a curl from his forehead. We can do that when you're better. He reached for her hand, his grip weak but earnest. Will you still be here tomorrow? She squeezed gently, her voice steady. I'll be here as long as you want me. Eli nodded, drifting back to sleep. James watched from across the room, his eyes unreadable. Claire rose slowly, moving to the kitchen where James followed, handing her a mug. You okay? He asked. She nodded, but her voice betrayed her. Just tired. They sat across from each other, the radiator hissing in protest, snow falling outside like time itself had paused. Then, without warning, Claire's breath hitched. She pressed her palm to her eyes as if to trap the emotions threatening to spill. James leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. Hey, I'm fine, she said too quickly. You're not. She shook her head, her voice breaking in places she'd always kept hidden. This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to feel this much. Her eyes glistened, raw and unguarded. I spent years perfecting distance, being needed but never needing, giving but never expecting. And now this boy draws me stars, saves me a chair, and She stopped, unable to finish. James didn't speak, didn't try to fix it. He just sat with her, his presence a quiet anchor. Her tears came silently, fully, not the graceful kind but raw, aching sobs from a place long buried. After a while, she found her breath again. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice shaky. Don't be, James said, his tone gentle but sure. She laughed once, unsteady. Eli will think I'm a mess. He'll think you're real, James replied. Claire looked up, her eyes searching his. Is that enough? He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice steady. It's everything. They sat in the warmth of shared vulnerability, two souls no longer pretending to be whole. I used to think strength was silence, Claire said quietly. Now I think it's showing up anyway. James smiled faintly, a rare softness in his eyes. You're showing up. So are you, she said, meeting his gaze. A beat passed, heavy with unspoken truce. Claire pulled a small envelope from her coat pocket, sealed with a wax stamp. James frowned. What's this? An invitation, she said, her voice steady now, to something I've never done before. He opened it, revealing a single card, a community design proposal authored by James Carter for a place where everyone belongs. He stared, stunned. I submitted it to the city's redevelopment board, she said, under my name, with your authorship. They'll review it next month. It's a long shot, but it's real. James looked at the card again, his voice barely audible. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet, Claire replied. Just promise me something. Anything, he said, his eyes locked on hers. If you build this, if they approve it, leave one room unfinished. He raised a brow. Why? Her smile was gentle, resolute. So someone else can finish it. Someone who needs to believe they belong. James leaned back, the weight of her gesture settling over him like a quiet tide. You know, he said slowly, when I lost my wife, I thought that was it. The world got quieter and I got smaller. I lived for Eli, but I didn't grow. Claire listened, her heart open, unguarded. Then you came in like thunder, he added, his voice soft but vivid, loud, brilliant, disruptive. And suddenly there was room again, for stars, for stories, for dinner at a table with someone who understands the silence. Her eyes stung, but she held his gaze. You make things bigger again, he finished. She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. So do you. He reached across the table, his hand finding hers, not as strangers or guests, but as something closer, something not yet named but deeply felt. In that quiet kitchen beside a sleeping child and a window frosted with hope, Claire Sterling was no longer a visitor to warmth. She had chosen to stay. The news broke on a Wednesday, the kind where the sky hung colorless and the wind stung with indifference. Claire stood in the boardroom of Sterling Ventures, the sharp scent of espresso and expensive ink cloaking the staleness of what was to come. A proposal circulated, clean and cold, a $42 million smart building to replace an aging South End neighborhood, solar-powered, app-integrated, security-optimized, perfect on paper. But Claire couldn't breathe. She knew that address. It was Eli's building, James's home. The hallway with the squeaky third stair, the door adorned with Eli's stars, the kitchen where she'd wept for the first time in decades. Her name blazed across the demolition notice, Sterling Ventures Redevelopment Initiative, Phase 1. A partner's voice cut through her haze. Miss Sterling, we're on schedule to vote. We've secured 3 tenants to vacate. Her voice faltered, then steadied, quiet but unyielding. Table it. The room froze. The CFO blinked, confused. I'm sorry? Table it, Claire Sterling repeated, her voice a quiet blade, cutting through the sterile air of the Sterling Ventures boardroom. Until further notice. A stunned silence gripped the room, a dozen executives staring, their faces a mix of confusion and irritation. You can't, one began, but Claire's gaze, sharp and unyielding, silenced him. I can, she said, her tone final, and I will. She stood, the weight of their stares trailing her as she walked out, but she didn't care. Somewhere in South End, a 6-year-old boy was likely cutting paper stars, and she was on the verge of shattering his sky. The city outside was a bruise of twilight, neither day nor night, the horizon painted in shades of wounded peaches. By the time Claire reached the Carter apartment, the building stood silent, its door locked tight. Taped to it, fluttering in the late wind, was a letter in crayon, Eli's familiar scrawl piercing her heart. Miss Claire, I heard Daddy on the phone. He thinks I don't listen, but I do. He said our building is going away because someone pushed a paper too far. Was it your paper? Her hands trembled as she read, each word a quiet accusation wrapped in grace. It's okay if it was. I just want to say thank you for sitting in the chair. I think maybe you're sad because you're always holding everything. Maybe you're tired. I hope you rest. It's okay not to come back. I understand. Eli. P.S. I left 1 star taped under the table. It's yours if you want it. P.P.S. Chairs are still here just in case. Claire read it once, then twice, her breath catching in a tangle of shame and heartbreak. For the first time in her adult life, she leaned her forehead against the chipped door, whispering, "I'm sorry." But the door didn't open. They were already gone. James hadn't answered his phone, not in hours, not since the letter. Claire paced her office, her voice sharp with desperation as she called everyone she could. Old contacts, mutual acquaintances, even the building super, who muttered something about a friend's spare couch in Somerville. They didn't tell me, she said to Sophie Grant, her assistant, her pacing relentless. Sophie hesitated, her voice soft. They probably didn't know you were behind it. Claire's eyes flashed. I wasn't, she snapped, then softer. Not on purpose. The rest of the day was a blur of chasing whispers through fog, phone numbers that led nowhere, leads that dissolved like snowflakes on warm skin. Defeat loomed, heavy and cold, until at midnight, she opened her purse and found it. A crumpled napkin, marked with Eli's clumsy marker strokes. A treasure map he'd drawn weeks ago for a park where he and James counted buses, scrawled with the words, "Just in case you ever want to find us when we're hiding." Claire stared at it, her heart a drumbeat of resolve. She grabbed her coat, the napkin clutched like a lifeline. The church shelter sat at the end of a quiet Somerville block, nestled between a laundromat and a deli that smelled of burnt onions and faint hope. Inside it was warm, dimly lit, hushed with the weight of lives pretending not to be lost. Claire stepped through the doors, her eyes adjusting to the soft glow. There, beneath a bulletin board draped in faded flyers, sat James, folding a blanket over Eli, who slept curled on a narrow cot. He didn't look up until her voice broke the silence. I got your letter. He froze, then turned slowly, his eyes dark with exhaustion and betrayal. Too late, he said, his voice low, cutting. Eli cried himself to sleep. I deserve that. Claire's voice shook, but she held his gaze. I didn't know. I tried to stop it the moment I saw, but you're right. I didn't see before. That's the difference. James stood, his frame taut with anger. You said you weren't here to fix things, but you broke them anyway. You had power and used it without looking. Her throat tightened, guilt clawing at her chest. This is real life, Claire. Rent, rooms, shelter. You show up when it's poetic, when the chair's waiting. But this, he gestured to the shelter, his voice raw. I didn't come to ask forgiveness, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. I came to ask if there's still a seat, even if it's on the floor. James stared, his silence heavy, searching. Then he looked at Eli, sleeping peacefully, and his voice softened. He still left you a star. Claire closed her eyes, a tear slipping free. I saw. James reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her, and she unfolded it. A drawing of her, him, and Eli in the shelter, reimagined as a glowing castle, its windows alight, stars brighter than any she'd seen him draw. Beneath, in Eli's blocky scrawl, home is not a place. It's people who don't run. Claire clutched the paper to her chest, her voice a whisper. I'm not running. James met her eyes, his voice steady but weighted. Then stay. Not because you're trying to undo something. Stay because you believe in what's still left. And she did with all her heart, for the first time in her life. The shelter smelled of overcooked rice and paper prayers, a fragile sanctuary against the cold. Claire hadn't left since midnight, pulling a chair to the corner by Eli's cot, a blanket draped over her shoulders. Not for warmth, but because she wanted to be nowhere else. Morning light crept through stained glass windows, soft and uncertain, as if unsure of its welcome. Eli stirred, rubbing his eyes, his small frame shifting under the blanket. Claire straightened, her heart a quiet drumbeat. He blinked at her, his sleepy smile sincere. You stayed? She nodded, her voice catching. Of course. He sat up slowly, glancing around the sparse room. It's not home, he said, his voice small. But Daddy says people can be home too. Claire bit her lip, fighting the swell in her chest. Your daddy's a very wise man. Eli looked at her with a child's blunt honesty. Are you staying for breakfast? They have square eggs. She smiled, a gentle laugh escaping. I've never had a square egg. They taste like circles but feel like corners, he said solemnly. Across the room, James turned, coffee in hand, watching them with the quiet ache of a man who'd tried not to hope and failed. Later that day, Claire made a decision. Not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that carved out space for something real. She returned to Sterling Ventures, her name still etched in glass at the entrance, echoing in the marble floors and silent elevators. But inside, she was changed. She called an emergency board meeting, the room bristling with discontent. I'm withdrawing our support from the Phase 1 redevelopment, she declared, her voice calm but unyielding. Effective immediately. Silence gave way to chaos, protests, accusations of breached contracts and locked-in funders. Claire raised a hand, sharp and final. This city doesn't need another smart building, she said, her words cutting through the din. It needs a true one, built on community, on listening, on staying. The room stared, stunned. She held up James's blueprint, its lines a testament to dreams long ignored. I'm allocating personal funds to back a new project, one already designed, just never heard. A community center, affordable housing, rooftop gardens, classrooms, reading rooms, spaces where people don't just live, but belong. A board member scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. You think your redemption story justifies killing a multi-million-dollar plan? Claire met his eyes, unflinching. I'm not interested in redemption. I'm interested in building something worth staying for. The silence that followed wasn't chaos. It was respect, grudging but undeniable. That evening, Claire returned to the shelter, not as a visitor, but with purpose, a worn brass key in her hand. James raised an eyebrow, his gaze wary. Planning to build us a castle? Something better, she said, her voice steady, warm. A home. James Carter's gaze lingered on the worn brass key in his hand, not as a transaction, but as a quiet gesture of trust, a door opening to something new. He looked at Claire Sterling, his eyes searching, softened by a truth he hadn't expected to find. You're not the same woman who first knocked on our door, he said, his voice low, steady. Claire met his gaze, her heart a quiet drumbeat of change. I know. Eli darted between them, his coat half-zipped, his grin wide enough to light the dim south end hallway. Are we going to see it? Claire's smile bloomed, warm and resolute. We're going to build it. That weekend, they walked the property, a tired building with creaking bones but a noble air, like a story waiting to be rewritten. Eli ran through the halls, arms outstretched like wings, his laughter echoing off the walls. Can I pick the color of the reading room? James glanced at Claire, a wry smile tugging at his lips. He's already made himself CEO. He has good instincts, she replied, her voice bright with affection. They paused in an empty room near the front, its dusty air alive with sunlight streaming through cracked windows. Claire stopped, her fingers brushing the windowsill where light danced across peeling paint. This was the front office. James nodded, his voice soft with memory. I used to dream of turning it into a listening room, a place where people could talk and know someone's hearing them. Claire's touch lingered on the sill, her eyes alight with possibility. Let's keep it that way. They stood in quiet communion, the space holding their shared vision, until Eli appeared, clutching a folding chair from a storage closet. I brought a chair, he said proudly, just in case someone shows up. James laughed, a rare, unguarded sound. For who, bud? Eli shrugged, his eyes sparkling with unshakable hope. For the next Claire. She froze, then smiled, understanding dawning. That chair wasn't for who she'd been. It was for someone else, someone not yet here, someone who might need what she once did, a place, a pause, a promise. Crouching beside Eli, she said, That's the most important chair in the whole building. He beamed, his joy alight in the dusty room. James watched, a question blooming behind his eyes, unspoken but heavy. You sure you're ready for this? He asked, his voice low, searching. Claire turned to him, her gaze steady, resolute. I'm not just ready, I'm home. In that broken building, surrounded by old walls and new dreams, something beautiful unfolded. A future not built on concrete or contracts, but on courage, trust, and people who chose to stay. Eli, the boy who always kept a chair open, was its heart. The first brick was metaphorical, laid not with cement, but with the sound of Claire knocking again on a door that wasn't hers. This time she wasn't asking or taking, she was inviting. Holding up a hand-colored flyer, she said, Eli drew this. It says, come build something with us. He added a sun, 2 stick figures, and what I think is a dinosaur. James leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a mix of amusement and awe in his eyes, a feeling Claire was beginning to crave. Recruiting construction workers with crayons now? They're more persuasive than contract, and she replied, and cheaper. James laughed, a warm, unguarded sound. You'd be surprised. He charges in Oreos. He stepped aside. You're early. I'm excited, she said, her smile bright. He nodded, his voice soft. Me too. The lot had transformed since their first visit. Old boards were gone, graffiti scrubbed clean, weeds that once choked the walls cleared away. In their place were chalk outlines, measuring tape, and hope, a community effort taking root. Neighbors had shown up, a retired plumber, a single mom offering to cook for volunteers, 2 high school kids with more enthusiasm than skill, but hearts big enough to lift beams. James stood with a clipboard, directing the chaos like a conductor without a baton. 3 pallets of brick arriving by noon, he said, paint samples in the office. Eli supervising the welcome mural. Claire glanced across the lot, where Eli stood on a step stool, a paintbrush twice his size in hand, tongue sticking out as he added stars to a blue-painted wall. Her smile deepened, warmed by his unyielding spirit. How's the speech? James asked, nudging her gently. What speech? She replied, feigning innocence. He raised an eyebrow. The press arrives at 5. Claire groaned, a playful edge to her voice. I was hoping that part was optional. You're the face of this place, he said. She turned toward the construction, the laughter, the dust catching sunlight like magic. No, she said softly. This is the face of it. James looked at her, his gaze lingering, deeper now, seeing her in a way that stirred something unspoken. You've changed, he said, his voice quiet but certain. Claire turned back, a quiet fire in her eyes. I've remembered who I was before I forgot. He didn't respond, but reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't hesitate. At 4:58 p.m., the lot buzzed with nervous joy. Kids clutching balloons, neighbors in mismatched lawn chairs, a folding table with lemonade and a crooked sign, Welcome to the Haven Initiative. A local journalist adjusted her microphone. Cameramen found their angles, and Claire stepped onto a makeshift podium of shipping crates, draped in a banner painted by Eli and his friends. Room for everyone. Her breath caught, unaccustomed to speaking from the heart, but that was the point. 6 months ago, she began, her voice steady yet raw. I sat alone in a penthouse I owned. It had every smart feature, but no warmth. I could control the temperature from my phone, but not the loneliness. She paused, her gaze finding Eli, cross-legged in the front row, grinning. I met a boy who saved me a seat at his table. Just one seat. It wasn't fancy or planned. It was open. That gesture rewrote everything I knew about home. Her voice grew stronger, resonant. Home isn't walls or wealth. It's the courage to keep a chair open, to listen, to stay. Applause rose, not thunderous but honest, a wave of shared belief. James joined her as the press filtered through, asking questions, snapping photos. But Claire's focus was elsewhere. On the breeze against her skin, the scent of sawdust and paint, the hum of voices that once had no place to speak. Later, as twilight settled like a soft blanket, she found herself alone in the listening room, its floors sanded, shelves half-filled, one corner left bare, waiting for someone else to shape its purpose. She sat in a single chair at the room's center, the silence alive with possibility. Footsteps approached. I thought I'd find you here, James said, his voice warm, familiar. She didn't turn. Do you think it's working? He moved closer. The building? No, she said softly. Us. James sat beside her, his presence steady, grounding. Do you remember what you said the night you cried in my kitchen? She nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You said I was real. You made me believe it, he said, reaching for her hand, both of theirs steady now. You don't need to fix everything to deserve to stay. You just need to keep showing up. Claire looked at him, her voice a whisper. Then I'm here. The room was quiet, but not empty, for the truest love comes not in grand declarations, but in presence. A chair pulled closer, a hand not letting go, a whisper heard by someone who had finally learned to listen. The Boston sky unfurled above the half-renovated rooftop of the Haven Initiative, a velvet canvas studded with stars. Not paper cutouts taped to a ceiling, but real, unfiltered, stretching endlessly into the night. Eli Harper lay sprawled on a sleeping bag, a donated telescope beside him, whispering names for constellations that existed only in his boundless imagination. That one looks like a dancing waffle, he said, pointing, his voice bright with wonder. James Carter chuckled, a low, warm sound that softened the edges of the cold night. You've got quite the imagination, bud. Claire Sterling sat cross-legged nearby, her usual blazer traded for a simple sweater, her hair loosely tied back, catching the faint glow of the city below. She wasn't watching the stars. Her eyes lingered on Eli, the boy who had opened a door to her heart, and James, the man who had let her stay. You know, Eli said, his gaze fixed on the sky, I used to think rich people didn't get cold. James raised an eyebrow, amused. Why's that? Because they always looked warm in movies, Eli replied, matter of fact. But I think they just had someone next to them. That's what keeps people warm. Claire's breath caught, a quiet ache blooming in her chest. James glanced at her, his eyes searching, but he said nothing, because Eli had just voiced the truth neither had dared to name. Later, after Eli drifted to sleep, his small hand clutching a flashlight and a half-eaten cookie, James pulled 2 folding chairs closer to the roof's edge. He handed Claire a cup of cocoa, real cocoa made from real milk, its warmth seeping through her fingers. I didn't know you could cook, she teased, a playful glint in her eyes. I didn't, James admitted with a smirk. The woman downstairs did. I bribed her with a month of free tutoring for her twins. Claire laughed, the soundlight, unguarded. Resourceful? That's my job description, he said, then, after a pause, and survival skill. They sat in silence, the city breathing around them, traffic humming, lights blinking like distant lighthouses in the dark. Do you miss your old life? James asked, his voice low, probing. Claire sipped her cocoa, the warmth grounding her. Sometimes, mostly the silence. He looked surprised, his brow furrowing. I used to think silence meant peace, she continued, her voice soft, reflective. But it was just loneliness, disguised as luxury. James nodded slowly, his gaze distant. I used to think chaos meant failure. They both smiled, a shared understanding blooming in the quiet. Surrounded by paint cans, sticky notes, community volunteers, and a very opinionated 6-year-old, they knew better now. Do you ever get scared? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James's gaze didn't waver. Only when I start to believe this might actually last. She swallowed hard, her heart tightening. James, she said softly, I'm not going anywhere. His eyes searched hers, a quiet intensity in their depths. You sure? She took a shaky breath, her voice steady despite the vulnerability. I've spent years building things meant to last forever. Buildings, systems, empires. But they were always one storm away from crumbling. She reached for his hand, her fingers finding his, warm and steady. Whatever this is, it doesn't feel like something I built. It feels like something I finally found. James looked down at their clasped hands, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Eli keeps asking if you're moving in. Claire blinked, caught off guard. And I told him grown-ups take longer to unpack their fears than their furniture. She smiled, gentle and knowing. Well, maybe it's time I started unpacking. They sat in the hush of the city, hands entwined, the rooftop cold but the space between them warm, alive with unspoken promises. James turned to her, his voice soft but deliberate. Can I ask you something? Of course, she replied, her heart open. The night you first came to dinner, what were you running from? Claire fell silent, the question stirring something deep within. Then she answered, not as a CEO, but as a woman stripped of armor. I wasn't running, she whispered, her voice raw. I was falling, and I didn't know it until someone pulled up a chair. James looked at her, really looked, his gaze piercing, yet tender. Gently he reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch a quiet anchor in the night. Stay tonight, he said, his voice steady, unguarded. Not as a guest, not as someone fixing something, as Claire. She looked down at the rooftop, at Eli dreaming under his sleeping bag, at the city that no longer felt like a fortress. Then back at James, whose eyes held nothing but quiet, patient truth. She didn't speak. Instead, she leaned in, resting her head on his shoulder, her breath mingling with his in the cool air. They stayed like that, wrapped in the stillness, until the sky began to soften with the first hues of dawn. No declarations, no grand confessions, just presence, just peace, just two people who had finally stopped running. Beneath them, a single paper star, its edges curling with age, clung to the wall beside the listening room's window, as if whispering, some chairs never go empty. They're just waiting for the right heart to come home. The morning breeze carried a gentle hum, neither cold nor warm, brushing past like a memory against the skin. A bright red ribbon stretched across the entrance to the newly completed Haven Initiative, fluttering playfully, tied with a triple knotted bow Eli had insisted on. So no grown-up messes it up before I say go. Claire stood to the side, her navy coat soft against the wind, holding scissors painted with gold stars by Eli's careful hand. Her hair danced lightly, her eyes scanning the crowd, not for cameras or donors, but for one face. Over here! Eli shouted from the front row, waving both arms like he was hailing a spaceship. Beside him, James smiled, one hand on Eli's shoulder, the other tucked into the coat Claire had once called reliably stubborn. Claire stepped up to the ribbon, her heart steady, the crowd falling silent, not from obligation, but from anticipation. She took a breath, her voice clear, resonant. We built this place with bricks, sweat, and setbacks, but it was already being built long before the first wall went up. Her gaze found James and Eli, her voice softening. It started with a child's invitation, a dinner, a seat, a question I didn't know I'd been waiting my whole life to hear. Do you want to have dinner with us? The crowd chuckled, a warm, shared sound. It was just one chair, Claire continued, but it held more than food. It held space, for grief, for grace, for growing. She paused, her eyes misting. This building stands not because of plans or money, but because of people who believed leaving a chair open might save someone. Turning to Eli, she smiled. Would you do the honors? Eli beamed, racing to her side, grabbing the scissors with both hands like he was cutting a portal to a new world. Okay, everybody, he shouted. On 3, 1, 2, 3. The ribbon snapped clean, and applause rang out like wind chimes in a summer storm, joyful, unscripted, free. In the heart of the Haven Initiative's listening room, two chairs faced each other, one bearing a book on its arm, the other holding a note in Eli Harper's unmistakable scrawl. Sit here if you want to be heard. Claire Sterling crossed the room, her steps deliberate, and settled into the empty chair, the wood creaking softly under her weight. She placed a folded photo on the table between them, a candid moment from weeks ago, capturing her, James Carter, and Eli on the rooftop, wrapped in blankets, laughing at a fleeting joke no one could recall. James sat across from her, his silence a quiet canvas for their shared history. After a pause, he spoke, his voice low, steady. I never thanked you. Claire tilted her head, curious. For what? For staying, he said, his eyes meeting hers unguarded. For choosing us. Her smile was soft, deep, a wellspring of truth. I didn't choose you, she whispered. I remembered you. James frowned, uncertainty flickering in his gaze. Claire leaned forward, her voice steady but raw. When I was young, I'd sit by a window wondering if anyone would ever knock. Not for business, not for brilliance, but for me. Her eyes held his, shimmering with a lifetime of unspoken longing. When Eli asked me to dinner, I didn't realize he was answering a question I'd stopped asking. James reached across the table, his hand covering hers, warm and grounding. You're not the same woman who showed up that night, he said, his voice soft but certain. I hope not, she replied, a faint smile breaking through. You're better. They sat in silence, not because words failed them, but because the most important truths had already been spoken, carried in the quiet weight of their shared presence. That evening, as the celebration's echoes faded and the building emptied, Claire stood by the entrance, locking the glass doors of the Haven Initiative. She turned to see James cradling Eli, fast asleep, his face buried in his father's coat, a small, sacred bundle. James adjusted the boy gently, his movements tender, deliberate. You coming home with us? He asked, his voice low, a quiet invitation. Claire hesitated, her gaze drifting back to the building, its lights dimmed, its walls warm, the air still humming with the laughter of the day. Beside the door, a bench bore a new plaque, installed just hours before, its words catching her breath. For everyone still waiting for someone to stay. She turned to James and nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I'm already home. Weeks later, on a chilly Boston afternoon, a man in tattered clothes stood outside the center, staring at the door with eyes that held too many days behind him and too few ahead. Eli opened the door, his small frame bright with unyielding hope. Hi, he said, his voice warm. Are you looking for someone? The man shook his head, his voice rough. Just passing. Tree. Eli tilted his head, his smile gentle. We have food, seats, and a really good couch. The man hesitated, uncertainty etched in his weathered face. I'm not sure I belong. Eli's grin widened, as if the answer was the simplest thing in the world. We always keep a chair open, just in case. Inside, Claire looked up from her desk, her heart catching as she watched the man step in. Not as a client, but as someone whose story had found its place. In this building, in this life, in the hearts that dared to stay, no chair ever stayed empty for long. If this story stirred something in your soul, even just a flicker, we'd love to hear from you. Which moment lingered in your heart, and where in the world are you reading this from? Share your thoughts below. Your words mean more than you know. If you believe in stories that mend, that shine light, that remind us of the quiet power of kindness, subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss another journey like this. Thank you, from the depths of our hearts, for being here. Until the next story, keep a chair open. Someone might just need it. See you soon.